Introduce Fern. Dr. Fern Riddell is a wonderful person. We've enjoyed chatting with her as we're getting ready to kick off, but she's also a cultural historian and an expert in sex, suffrage, and entertainment in the Victorian and Edwardian eras. She's the host of the History Channel's podcast series, Not What You Thought, and a presenter on BBC Four's A Victorian Scandal, the Rudest Book in Britain. Her first book, The Victorian Guide to Sex, tackled the myths of Victorian prudishness, and her latest book, Sex, Lessons from History, is an exploration of the attitudes and identities the Western world has had towards sex and gender. Historical consultant for the BAFTA award-winning BBC and Amazon drama Ripper Street, she has advised on dramas for both the BBC and ITV2. As an on-screen expert, she's appeared on many specialist factual productions, including for the BBC, Sky Arts, and Smithsonian, and has appeared as an expert historian for radio and television across the world. She writes for The Guardian, Huffington Post, Times Higher Education, The Telegraph, The New Statesman, and BBC History Magazine. Her work has also appeared in the Daily Mail, Penthouse, and Time.com. And I guess now she can add she's been a presenter on History Symposium. So please welcome me, or join me in welcoming Dr. Fern Riddell.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was my entire biography. I'm very embarrassed, but that was lovely. Thank you so much for having me here today. And I'd like to thank the invitation that I got for the History Symposium. It is an honor to be able to be part of our global community of historical research and historical researchers, because I think in the times we're living through, the opportunity to connect globally is incredibly important, and have those links and maintain strong bonds across all of our oceans and across the world. I can't wait to tell you all about the life of the incredible Kitty Marian, suffragette bomber and birth control activist, and the woman who she fought beside. Today's title is The Weaker Sex, Suffragette Violence and the Fight for the Vote. And it's a subject that I am incredibly proud to be able to talk about and to have researched on. I'm lucky enough to be an alumni of Royal Holloway, a college of the University of London, which is a fact I actually share with one of the UK's most famous suffragettes, Emily Wilding Davidson, who was a student there before she went to Oxford. Next year will be the 110th anniversary of her attempt to stop a rider at the 1913 Epsom Derby, possibly hoping either to end the race or to attach a Votes for Women banner to one of the horses. She was unsuccessful and died of her injuries 4 days later on the 8th of June. Her actions gave her the epitaph of the suffragette martyr, or the supreme sacrifice, and her death is often talked about now as being crucial in the fight for the vote. But there is another side to Emily that you are unaware of. In fact, there's a side to our entire history and knowledge of the women's movement in my country that we have all been unaware of. And today I'm going to show you the challenging and controversial realities of the actions of many women like Emily and Kitty, and which they took in the fight for the vote. If I could have my next slide, please, Tom. Thank you. This is the traditional image that we have of the suffragette movement, and those among you may recognize the famous Annie Kenney and Christabel Pankhurst. It's empowered young women holding placards. They often marched, determined to win the right to vote and have their views represented on equal terms with men. For those who may be unaware, prior to 1918 in the UK, only men were afforded the legal right to vote. Women had, of course, managed to find ways to express themselves in voting, but in the early half of the 1800s, a new act defined for the first time in law the legal right for only men to be allowed to vote. And it was across the 19th century, from a very long campaign, that women over 30 who owned property were finally given the right to vote and to have their voices heard and stand in government in 1918. But it wasn't until a decade after that, in 1928, that the Representations of the People's Act granted every citizen in my country the right to vote and a say in how we are governed, who we are, and what we stand for. Could I have my next slide, please, Tom? So how did we get here? There had been multiple suffrage societies formed across the country during the Victorian era, but in 1903, a new one emerged that has dominated our history, our memory, and our understanding of the women's movement in the UK. And that's the WSPU, or the Women's Social and Political Movement, headed by the enigmatic Pankhurst family and led by this woman, Emmeline Pankhurst. Could I have my next slide, please, Tom? Thank you. This is one of my favorite images of Emmeline. You can see her standing between the lions at Trafalgar Square, and in front of her is a huge crowd, mostly of men, but also of women too, and children, listening to what she has to say in her argument and her fight for why women should get the vote. Those men that you see right in front of her, busily scribbling away on their pads, are newspaper reporters. And one of the things that I absolutely adore about writing and researching in the 19th century is our newspapers are one of our most important resources for historical information, for source material, and for the accurate transcription of words and what was actually said. Because unlike today, where we only tend to really get snippets, newspapers would often print in totality the entirety of what someone said, and court transcripts, criminal cases, everything. So they are a fantastic, fantastic resource. What you see here is Emmeline using one of the skills she was most famous for, which is her power of rhetoric. She's a tiny woman, but you can see she is absolutely commanding this stage that she has set herself. And what she's expressing to people is her desire for the women's movement to move in a new direction. It became the motto of the WSPU, deeds, not words. And that is, we have spoken to you enough, you are not listening. Action is the only thing that is going to change the situation for all women here in the UK. Could I have my next slide, please, Tom? The newly passionate and increasingly militant language of the Pankhursts was used to attract women from across the country to their London marches. This is the image of Dora Thulis. She was known and she was talked about in the press as the baby suffragette. She was 16, 17 years old, a Yorkshire factory girl, and she came down inspired by the rhetoric of the suffragettes to march for women's rights. She was subsequently arrested, and you can see in this image the terror on her face of what is happening to her. She was a good girl, she was a working class girl, and she suddenly found herself in the arms of the law. And policemen at this time treated the women that they were arresting extremely aggressively. We have horrific reports of the abuse and the injuries suffered by the women who were arrested by the Metropolitan Police at these marches. This image became incredibly famous, and it was printed across the front pages. It was one that really struck a chord with not just women, but a lot of people across the globe. Now, while she was called the baby suffragette, that word suffragette was not one that women gave to themselves. It was actually invented by the Daily Mail in 1907, one of the few things we have to thank the Daily Mail for in this country. And it became a word that was invented to primarily target and demean the women who were fighting for the vote, but it became something that they then seized for themselves as their own identity. And it's because women who defined themselves as suffragettes were so different to any part of the women's movement that had gone before, that they have become the entire identity of the women's movement. When you think about the fight for the vote, what people will immediately say to you is the word suffragette. But in reality, the word suffragette in this period only meant the members of the WSPU. And the reason why it was coined, and the reason why the women of the WSPU called themselves suffragettes, was because of their new tactics, which were designed to persuade the government to give the votes to women, because they felt betrayed, and because the police had become increasingly violent. These new tactics were extremely dangerous. Could I have my next slide, please, Tom? One of the new tactics the suffragettes turned to were the arson and bomb attacks. This is the image of the aftermath of an arson attack at Kew Gardens in February 1913. Both the Tea Pavilion and the Orchid House were targeted by a suffragette who used a variety of aliases, Olive Hockin, Olive Warry, Joyce Locke, to carry out dangerous and militant activities in the fight for the vote. She was a London art student, and in 1912 she had been found hidden in the Music Hall building in Aberdeen, waiting for George Lord, armed with a rudimentary bomb. After being discovered and arrested, when she went to court, she pleaded not guilty and threw her shoe at the magistrate. Using different names and identities helped the suffragettes stay ahead of the police and allowed Olive to travel across the country to commit acts of violence. From Aberdeen to London, she was one of the women the Pankhursts encouraged to attack and destroy property, and to create a sense of fear and terror about what the suffragettes might do next. Could I have my next slide, please, Tom? If men use explosive and bombs for their own purpose, they call it war. The throwing of a bomb that destroys other people is then described as a glorious and heroic deed. Why should a woman not make use of the same weapons as men? It is not only war we have declared, we are fighting a revolution. That's a quote from Christabel Pankhurst in 1913. I want you to look at that language and for a moment forget that it was written by a woman. How would you feel if this was a historical male figure in history? What would your expectations be of their commitment and their decision to use militant violence against whatever opponent they saw as the people that they had to fight against? This, for me, is one of the moments where we have to understand the suffragette campaign was intensely violent and intensely dangerous, and they meant it. This is not for show. This is not to try and persuade people that they might do something. This is a clear declaration of attack. If I could have my next slide, please, Tom. Ooh. That should be a Lloyd George bomb. So sorry, don't worry. Do you have that one? That's the one just before this one. Do you want me to keep going?
Yes, I don't, because what I did was I was cutting and pasting into the PowerPoint, so I must have missed that one. Sorry.
Don't worry. I'll describe it for people.
Yeah.
What this image with the slide we should have seen. If you could go back one slide for me, we'll put up the pavilion one. Thank you. I want you to really focus on this destruction that you see in front of you, because when the suffragettes decided to commit to an arson and bombing campaign, they used incendiary devices that destroyed many things. And one of their most famous attacks was the cottage of Lloyd George. In 1913, aiming for one of their most high-profile targets, the suffragettes bombed the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lloyd George's newly renovated country cottage. Some historians have claimed that this was carried out by Emily Wilding Davidson and 5 others, but as little to no research has ever been done on the extreme violence of the suffragettes, I can't justify that and hold to it right now, although I do feel quite strongly that they may have been correct. Because what I'm showing you here today, and the images and the rest of the images, and throughout my book, Death in 10 Minutes, is research that is completely new historical evidence. No one else had ever explored the extremist violence of the suffragettes in detail, bringing together the police reports, newspaper reports, and the previously ignored personal autobiography of those militant suffragettes, which had been hidden away and forgotten since the 1930s. For many people in 2018, there was no knowledge that the WSPU became increasingly violent, and the papers soon turned their attacks the suffragette outrages. One of the earliest recordings of this term came from the Morpeth Herald in November 20th, 1909, when a suffragette attacked a young Winston Churchill with a horsewhip on the platform of Bristol railway station. In the same month, Selina Martin and Leslie Hall disguised themselves as orange sellers and, armed with a catapult and missiles, attacked Prime Minister Asquith's car in Liverpool. The following year, one of the first instances of a suffragette causing physical harm to a member of the public is recorded in Battersea. A clerk suffers serious burns as he attempts to stop a suffragette from throwing a liquid over the papers of a member of Parliament. Risk or injury to the public has always been vehemently denied by many suffragette historians and the suffragettes themselves, but the newspapers and even the accounts of the violent militant suffragettes prove that there were numerous instances where injuries occurred, that personal risk and death was great. One of the most dangerous suffragette attacks occurred in Dublin in 1912. Mary Lee, Gladys Evans, Lizzie Baker, and Mabel Capper set fire to the Theatre Royal during a packed lunchtime matinee attended by Asquith. They left a canister of gunpowder close to the stage and threw petrol and lit matches into the projection booth, which contained highly combustible film reels. Earlier in the day, Mary Lee had hurled a hatchet towards Asquith, which had narrowly missed him and instead cut the Irish MP Mr. Redmond on the ear. 1912 proved to be an escalation point in the violence of the militant suffragettes. Glasgow Art Gallery had its glass cases smashed, bank and post offices were smashed from Kew to Gateshead. In September, 23 trunk telegraph wires were cut at the London Road at Potter's Bar, and on the 28th of November, simultaneous attacks on post boxes occurred across the country. This is like taking out the internet and all of the telephone services in modern day. By the end of the year, 240 people had been sent to prison for militant suffragette activities. The newspapers began to carry weekly roundup of the attacks, and reports of suffragette violence are clearly evident across the country, with papers like the Glasgow Journal and Liverpool Echo running dedicated columns to report the latest outrages. During 1913, a suffragette attacked the glass cabinets in the Jewel House of the Tower of London, while in Dundee, in Scotland, 4 postmen were severely injured by phosphorus chemicals left in post boxes. In Dumbarton, 20 telegraph wires were cut, Kew Gardens Orchid House was attacked, as we see here, and its tea house burned down. In Ilford, 3 streets had the fire alarm wires cut, and in Saunderton, a railway station was destroyed, while placards entitled "Votes for Women" and "Burning for the Vote" were left. Croxley Station, near Watford, also suffered a similar fate, although the attack was not initially attributed to the militants until a suffragette newspaper was delivered to the station master with a scribbled inscription, "Afraid copy left got burnt." The suffragettes always left evidence claiming both the arson and bomb attacks as their own, leaving letters and pamphlets at all of the sites. But who were the women carrying out these attacks, and how did they justify such violent actions? If you could go to the slide of Kitty Marion, please, Tom. For the last few years, or for many years now, I've been studying this incredible woman, Kitty Marion. She is a musical star and militant suffragette. Born in 1871 in Germany, Kitty had been sent to England by her abusive father when she was just 15. By 19, she was on the stage, and her life moves from being a well-known musical star to a renowned and dangerous criminal to a soldier for the WSPU who was forced into hiding and falsely labeled as a German spy just before the outbreak of World War I, who was then smuggled out of the country to America, where she became a prominent birth control campaigner working between the UK and the US until her death in 1944. I call her Edwardian England's most dangerous woman due to her life as a militant suffragette, which saw her create bombs and arson attacks and travel across the country fighting what she believed was a war, a real war, against the men and women who refused to allow her the vote and to protect her rights. And it's her belief in her rights, her right to democracy, to the vote, to having her voice heard, that really drive Kitty. She had been attacked multiple times in her industry and believed the only way to protect women in the workplace was by women having the vote. And that's something I think we often forget. If I could have my next slide, please, Tom. I gritted my teeth and determined that somehow I would fight this vile economic and sex domination over women, which had no right to be, and which no man or woman worthy of the term should tolerate. We often forget what the reasons are women fought for the vote, why they were there, why they wanted it. And people always say, oh, well, women just wanted political representation. That wasn't Kitty's motivation. Kitty wanted political representation because she had been abused in her industry, because she'd been part of the casting couch culture, and wanted very much to protect women and other actresses like her from it. Her desire to challenge and change her working life and the lives of all women and girls within her industry was built on her belief that not only should she be able to live and work independent of the desires of men, but that sex should not be used as a trade or a commodity between the sexes. Could I have my next slide, please, Tom? This is one of my favorite pictures of Kitty, taken just at the beginning of her militancy. She had heckled Lloyd George at the National Eisteddfod in Wales, which is a huge cultural festival. And you can see her here. Her hair has been torn down. She's being hauled away by policemen. But one of the things I think is the most important about this picture is look at the face of that woman behind the man, behind the policeman, the woman who is screaming with anger at her. We have to understand that in this period in our history, the votes and the rights that we today take for granted, many women thought were unnecessary. And they believed that the fight for the vote was not only unwomanly, but wrong, false, and a degradation of our sex. Women like Kitty are the reason we have the vote today, however we may feel about their militant actions. Marion's militancy increased from 1910 onwards. She was responsible for arson and bomb attacks on railway stations, piers, MPs' houses, parks, racecourses, telegram wires, broken windows, and a vocal and passionate voice on stage and in the press. She used her knowledge of cities, entertainment spaces, and travel from the life she had experienced as a music hall star. She was able to set an attack and disappear down the back alleys and into side streets as if she was a city native. Her touring diary corresponds with later sites of attack: Liverpool, Newcastle, St Leonard's, and Manchester. And during her arrest for an arson attack at Hurst Park Racecourse, she was found to be lodging with a theatrical landlady, Ma Mac, even though Marian had not performed on the stage for some time. One of her most destructive attacks was on the home of the MP from St Leonard's-on-Sea in Portsmouth, Arthur Ducrot, in April 1913. If I could have my next slide, please, Tom. This is the exterior of Arthur Ducrot's house. As you can see, it's been absolutely gutted. Marian left an incendiary device, a bomb, that when it exploded, then of course left an extreme fire raging through the house. And one of the things that I find fascinating about this picture is you can see the people standing and staring, watching it. If I could have my next slide, please, Tom. This is the interior. It was the opening slide, but you can see it here now in more detail. And if anyone is interested in this, I can absolutely recommend going onto the Pathé website, Pathé, which is the famous cinema and film company, and searching Arson Attack Arthur Ducrot, because for one of the first times, we have a film camera that captured the footage of the immediate aftermath. You can still see smoke rising from the building. And you see people coming to stand and stare and walk away to try and understand what has happened and why. These attacks were directed and in some cases orchestrated by the Pankhurst leadership, who passionately believed that deeds, not words, would be the only thing that convinced the government to give them the vote. If I could have my next slide, please, Tom. This is a very long quote, so I am only going to pick out a tiny part of it. It is in this absolute spirit that our women went forth to war. In the first month of guerrilla warfare, an enormous amount of property was damaged and destroyed. This is from Emmeline Pankhurst's My Own Story. And I think it's very important for us to understand. You can see here at the end, she ends with discussing Lloyd George's attack, partially destroyed, a bomb having been exploded in the early morning before the arrival of the workmen. We have to acknowledge that the Pankhurst leadership took direct ownership of these attacks. And it is absolutely bizarre to me, frightening in many ways, that our history and our recollection of it was then erased. When I grew up, when I was in school, I certainly was never taught about the violent actions of the suffragettes. And when I first started researching and writing about them, I was met with extreme anger and rejection of our accurate history, because people found a discussion and a revelation that those we idolize could have committed such violent and dangerous actions abhorrent. But we have to understand our history. If I could have my next slide, please, Tom. We have to understand our history because we have to understand how painful it was for the women who carried out these actions. These images of suffragettes being hauled off on their marches, of being beaten and taken into cells, of being starved, of being force-fed, are incredibly important, and they are the ones we remember. But we have to set them alongside the images of the bomb attacks, because we have to understand all of the levels of commitment and all of the levels of pain, anger, rage, and dedication that these women were prepared to go to. If I could have my next slide, please, Tom. This is another quote from Emmeline Pankhurst. where she talks about the impact on the public of the suffragette bombs. And it's the last two lines that I find really important. The public were thrown into a state of emotion and insecurity and frightened expectancy. Not yet did they show themselves ready to demand of the government that the outrages be stopped in the only way they could be stopped, by giving votes for women. It is, I know I've said this before, but I do find it incredibly frustrating that we have forgotten this history, because we have to understand that the WSPU and the suffragettes themselves were operating as a terrorist organization. It is the earliest domestic terrorist organization that we clearly have present in the UK, and how the police attempted to target them, how the police attempted many times unsuccessfully to shut them down, is vital to our understanding of our history and the role of women at this time. I also find it bizarre that we believe women were not capable of these actions, that we think women at this time were delicate and gentle and tying themselves to railings and suffering in silence. They weren't. They were fighting back as soldiers, as armed members of the public, determined to be heard and to fight against a corrupt government that refused to see them as human beings. If I could have my next slide, please, Tom. During the period 1906 to 1914, there were 1,214 court appearances by suffragette activists, yet the majority of those had only ever appeared before the judge for suffrage-related crimes once before. This would suggest that the idea of a large-scale militant activity carried out by just a handful of dedicated women, as few historians who have acknowledged the violence have claimed, is simply mathematically impossible. But there is evidence that multiple attacks were carried out by certain perpetrators, people who acted as heads of cells, people who acted as heads of resistant organisations and groups across the country. And Kitty Marion was one of those. We see her hand in attacks from Manchester to Portsmouth, going in, travelling incognito, escaping from the police, and joining up with women who operated in local areas to become a source of serious violence. A train that was left standing between Hampton Wick and Teddington was almost totally destroyed by fire in the early hours of Saturday morning on the 26th of April. It was an attack Kitty orchestrated and recorded in her diaries. The train was afterwards driven into Teddington Station, where an examination resulted in the discovery of inflammable materials in almost every set of coaches. Among the articles found in the train were partially burnt candles, 4 cans of petroleum, 3 of which had been emptied of their contents, a lady's dressing case contained with a quality of cotton wool, and packages of literature dealing with the women's suffragette movement. Newspaper cuttings of recent suffragette outrages were also found scattered about the train. The method adopted was very simple. First, the cushions were saturated with petroleum, then small pieces of candles were lighted immediately under the seat. This was pasted into her biography and her collection that she had cut out. Like many music hall actresses, Kitty kept scrapbooks of all of her performances and all of her reviews. When she became a suffragette bomber, she did exactly the same for all of her suffragette arson attacks. And if you'd like to see more, the Museum of London has digitized that archive and that scrapbook of hers that deal with all of her suffragette bombs, and you can now see it from the comfort of your own home, which is incredible because I spent all of my research years going into the Museum of London archive and looking at it in the flesh, and now I'm feeling like it was this incredibly secret private source that I had found, and now everyone can see it and have access to it, which is absolutely brilliant. Long may Kitty's name be known. May I have my next slide, please, Tom? This is an arson attack on Hatcham Church, and one of the things I think always strikes me whenever I look at this image is the huge crowd of people standing, staring, watching it. I've always wondered if those perpetrators responsible for it have been caught in the crowd, and we just don't know. The WSPU acted like a regulated army with professional soldiers, seeing the Edwardian period as a civil war between the sexes, and they played heavily on the advertised language of being a woman's army and their rhetoric of rebellion. Could I have my next slide, please, Tom? This again is where is another image of Hatcham. I've always wondered we see these women right at the front underneath their umbrellas, standing quite conspiratorially together. Are they the people who carried out the attack? We may never know. Could I have my next slide, please, Tom? Kitty Marian knew and worked with Emily Wilding Davidson as a fellow soldier in the fight for the vote. In fact, she records in her diary that shortly before her death, Davidson gave her money to buy munitions to carry out the bombings and the arson attacks that they were committing. But all we tend to know about Emily Wilding Davidson is her death. And I think this does a disservice to her memory. It's only through other people like Kitty that we see a different, truer image of her. Sanitizing history just because it might make us feel better or more self-righteous is never a good idea. Could I have my next slide, please, Tom? This is the image of Emily as she would have been when she was a lot younger, when she was a student, when she was starting to become a member of the suffragette movement. Could I have my next slide, please, Tom? One of the motivations and the powerful motivations that she left was the idea in my mind was that one big tragedy may save many others. It was a motivation that she never lost. It was a belief that self-sacrifice for the movement would be the only thing that would wake up the British public to the horrors that women faced being unable to be heard and to be treated as equal members in this country. Could I have my next slide, please, Tom? Emily Wilding Davidson died after falling under the hooves of the King's horse at the Epsom Derby. Her death triggered responses from all corners of the suffragette movement, but the most violent reaction came from Kitty Marian, who, along with her companion, Clara Givens, burned down the pavilion at Hurst Park Racecourse after learning of what she believed was a supreme sacrifice. It led to her subsequent arrest and imprisonment. Kitty now became viewed as a martyr to the cause herself, as church services were disrupted by shouts in support of her freedom, and a bomb was discovered in the Lyceum Theatre in Taunton, was revealed to the press to have the words, "Vote for women, judges beware, martyrs for the law, and release our sisters," painted along the side. If I could have the next slide, please, Tom. In 1914, the continual destruction of homes, pavilions, churches continued, with the year containing some of the most well-known arson attacks on works of art. With the year containing some of the most well-known arson attacks on works of art, as Mary Richardson slashed the Rokeby Venus at the National Gallery in London. The capital city of London saw a wave of cultural violence. The British Museum had mummy cases smashed, and bombs were discovered in St. Paul's, the Metropolitan Tabernacle, including evidence that had a postcard bearing the words, "Put your religion into practice and give women the right to freedom." If I could have my next slide, please, Tom. This is another report of a discovery of a bomb that was found, and it's from where I got the title for Death in 10 Minutes, which is the autobiography. It is the biography of Kitty Marian. The latest suffragette outrage frustrated by wind. A bomb was found on the inside of the entrance gate of Smeaton Tower in Plymouth Hoe. The wick on top of the canister had been lit, but the wind had extinguished the flame. On the cylinder were the words, "Votes for women, death in 10 minutes." These attacks were specifically designed to influence the government and public to change their opinions on women's suffrage, not by choice, but by threats and acts of violence. All of these acts were carried out against the backdrop of women chained to railings, rushing Parliament, refusing to pay taxes, and marching in their thousands against a government that had refused to listen to their petitions or take them seriously. Who knows how far this would have gone, or what else could have happened if the First World War had not broken out? If I could have my next slide, please, Tom. There was, of course, a huge amount of press and disinformation that was covering the suffragette movement at this time. Belief that inferences that they were sexually deviant, inferences that they would use anything they could to try and convince MPs to support them, such as this report of a lovesick socialist MP who is deeply in love with a suffragette. But just as today, everywhere that we found violence, there was a desire to react to it with humor. If I could have my next slide, please, Tom. This is a popular satirical image of a suffragette, of a suffragist whose campaign for franchise has been corroded and destroyed by militant corrosive fluid, i.e. by the suffragettes, because the suffragist movement was the peaceful, non-violent wing of the women's movement that was operating in the UK at this time. One of the things I want to leave you with is an understanding that the suffragette bombs were not minor. They were often pipe bombs, smoke bombs, filled with the most horrific detritus and implements, and they were incredibly dangerous and incredibly destructive. This was an organization that did not want to stop or withhold violence until it got what it was demanding. Could I have my next slide, please, Tom? This is the result of those attacks. Anything could happen to anyone at any point. And the British public were indeed descended into fear and confusion. And historians today are questioning and asking why suffragette attacks happened, how successful they were, and what the impact was, and if we should acknowledge them. I think we absolutely have to acknowledge the violent actions in totality of the militant suffragettes, because history is all around us, and it is far better to know it in its entirety, or at least the closest we can get to it, than it is to propagate myth and half-truth. Could have my final slide, please, Tom. This is my book, Death in 10 Minutes, Kitty Marion, Kitty Marion's life. And it is her autobiography and the stories of all of the women, as many as I could find, who conducted this campaign. I think it's a history we have to acknowledge. I think it's one we cannot shy away from. And I think for women today, when we are still fighting for so many of our rights, it's important to know what our ancestors were willing to do. How we feel about it is a question for ethical moments, but these actions took place and we have to acknowledge them. And that's the end. Thank you very much, Tom and Chris.
Thank you so much. Fascinating history, but I also find myself in the notes I'm making to myself at the side here, fascinating bigger issues too, and maybe some of the questions there will lead us down that path a little bit. I just want to remind you and our viewers as well that there's a little bit of a lag between what you're presenting here on Zoom and the YouTube channel. So sometimes it takes a few minutes for those questions to come out. So I'm starting to see some of them roll in a little bit, but just I wonder if I can start with one that I noted down, hopefully not too controversial. You've mentioned sort of the newspapers throughout, and I mean I really think we're sort of viewing newspapers almost as a social media of the time. I'm wondering if there was a change in sort of the newspaper opinions. So when you're reading them, do you ever find that there's ever a shift in opinion? Were they ever positive towards the suffragettes or the suffragists? Did they change when it became more violent, or did it ever really change? Was it always very negative?
Well,
what
obviously,
were
much
their
like
thoughts?
today, newspapers and newspaper barons were written entirely politically. There's no such thing as an unbiased newspaper, either now or then. So we see very clearly specific newspapers taking specific approaches to the suffragettes, some being exceptionally hard on them, exceptionally aggressive towards the suffragettes, others being supportive. The violent action does cause conflict between those suffragette newspapers and those writers who had attempted to write for the suffragettes and in their favor. But throughout all of this period, you will always find differences of opinions. And I think obviously the suffragettes were publishing themselves The Suffragette, which was their own newspaper, which was an campaign because it would include images of the press photography of the bombings. And you would turn the page and the next page would be a huge image of a suffragette on her deathbed from force feeding and the terrible reaction. So they were incredibly good at kind of mass marketing their propaganda to show what they're doing, how dangerous it is, but also the horrific reasons why to really pull that emotional card on their followers, on people who are interested in them, to show the violence of the regime. And I think that's something we have to kind of, when we're looking back at this period in English history and British history, we have to understand that from the suffragettes' point of view, we had a corrupt regime. We had a regime that was incredibly dangerous, that was there geared towards the destruction and demonization of women. And that's what they were fighting back against. We tend to culturally treat the suffragette movement as nice ladies who marched a bit. And I think that is a serious, serious factual error that we really need to correct.
So I will ask a question as Chris digs into the chat and pulls some questions out of there, that there are some that have come in. How did this link in with the rest of the world? So around this time period in Canada, there was the suffrage movement, and I imagine there was campaigns for the vote in a lot of other countries.
There were, and I think what's fascinating is when you're looking at the history of the campaign for the vote for women, the 19th century is huge because so many countries were fighting that battle and were fighting at the turn of the 20th century for women to be given equal rights. We see it in the US, which adopted the term suffragette. Often we see it turning up in US newspapers, although they had no violent campaign. And it is fascinating how much the British suffragettes became this huge symbol across the world for women fighting for the vote. So huge that when World War I broke out, there were satirical postcards that were dropped over enemy lines, denoting that we weren't going to send men to fight you, we were going to send our militant suffragettes armed with bombs. And they're absolutely brilliant, these pictures. I think one of them is printed in Death in 10 Minutes. I think we got the rights to it. But they're absolutely fascinating. So the women of England, the suffragettes, were seen as some of our most violent and militant and dangerous soldiers, which I think is brilliant when you're looking at the history of World War I. What's also equally fascinating is we know that World War I was this decisive moment where the suffragette campaign had been building, the arson and bombing attacks had been getting more and more severe, and the police and the Home Office were tearing their hair. I've had wonderful records in the archives in Kew where we see the Metropolitan Police writing to the Home Office going, please, can we have one motorbike? Because the suffragettes have cars. And so they're just getting away from us because we don't have access to this. So they're the way that they're orchestrating their campaign is technologically so superior to what the police were expecting or understood. They didn't have any way of combating them. We know that when World War I happens, it is this intense sudden stop. And Pankhurst and the WSPU come out and say they're going to commit to a ceasefire. They're not going to be continuing their bombing. They're going to throw all of their efforts and their women's efforts behind the war, to support the munitions, everything else. And there comes a moment where Emmeline Pankhurst writes to the government and says, you need Russia to be your ally. We need Russia to be our ally in the war. Well, I'm the leader of a revolutionary movement. Russia has just given women the right to the vote, and they have just had a huge revolution. Send me as the diplomat to discuss joining us in the war. And the government does. It's one of those moments that just kind of blows my mind when people try to downplay the impact of the suffrage movement, because that is a very clear moment where Emmeline Pankhurst is being sent on a diplomatic mission as the leader of a violent revolution to another leader of a violent revolution to beg for help in the war. So in terms of what the global impact was of the English suffragettes, of the British suffragettes, it was huge. And I think we still don't fully understand its limits.
Well, thank you. We've had a few questions, and this is one that I noted down as well. Was there, I think you've spoken to sort of the divided opinion on using violence. Was there a divide within the WSPU, or were they very focused on taking this militant track? And then can you talk about maybe the divide outside that body as well?
So obviously with every social movement, there's an earlier history. And in the 19th century, in the Victorian period, when Emmeline Pankhurst was young, she was very close with Millicent Fawcett and with the kind of main campaign for the fight for women's suffrage, which was entirely non-violent. In 1903, she splits from all of these main suffrage movements to form the WSPU, with the sole goal being deeds, not words, being action over arguments. And that then becomes violent, extreme violent militant action, ending up at the bombing campaigns. So the WSPU and the suffragettes themselves are, from the beginning, absolutely the violent wing of the suffragette movement. Every other suffragette movement, suffragist movement and campaign looks at the suffragettes as mad people and wishes very much that they weren't there, because they feel it's an incredibly damaging, bad narrative and bad action that's only going to cause the fight to be delayed, the success of the fight to be delayed. I personally, having studied this for a long time, whilst I find the actions abhorrent in themselves, I do think they are fundamental to getting the vote. People say this violence didn't have any, wasn't justified, didn't have any impact, and we would have got the vote anyway. Well, you have to look at who the government awarded the vote to in 1918. They didn't award it to all women. They afforded it to the women who were being regularly arrested as suffragette bombers, women over the age of 30 who own property. That's a really fundamental thing to me, because Emmeline had threatened at the end of the war to go back to start up again, or at least there had been threats made that the suffragette violent campaign, once the war was over, would start up. And I personally, when I look at it, see a very clear link between a post-World War I government that's in the middle of a flu pandemic going, Jesus Christ, on top of this, we can't cope with the suffragettes starting back their nationwide campaign of arson and bombing attacks. We've lost so many men. Our police still have no clue how to deal with it. So let's just give them the vote, give that kind of identity of womanhood the vote, and we'll worry about the rest of womankind another time. So I really do think we have to thank those women, as abhorrent as we may find their actions, for the vote, because the campaign to get the vote had been happening for two women, had been going for nearly 100 years and had not got anywhere until then. As hard as that is for us to hear and to admit to.
So this was the last question I wrote down, and I apologize to the chat that I'm a little bit monopolizing the questions, but maybe a little bit more controversial. Is there a danger in lionizing these women or holding them up as martyrs? I think that sort of ties in nicely to what you've said, but it's also a much bigger issue in our society today when we look at the way we want things to change. Is that a real danger?
So this is a point I really try to explore and explain at the end of the book, is my personal reaction to this. And it comes down to this very much. As a historian, I believe our key purpose is the truth of our history and conserving it. That's it. That's the most important thing. And this part of our history has been hidden and sanitized, and it must come forward and it must come out. How we then feel about it is equally as important to have, but it's the next conversation. And I think the thing I say in the book about this is we have to be able to understand our heroes are flawed and are complicated, and will commit actions we find abhorrent, and will commit, and even the most noble cause will have parts of it and parts of its history that we might find distasteful, upsetting. But human beings are innately complex creatures, and we have to acknowledge them in totality. This is why we're all historians, right? This is the purpose of our lives, is getting as close to the truth of history as we can. And I absolutely will defend forever our right to do that as historians, to expose that history. because what we're doing is providing people with the opportunity to be educated and to make informed choices for themselves over who they lionize. That's the point. You know, we lionize people all the time, whether that's accurate or not, but we should do that in an informed way. And we should understand the context of the actions and the reasons why we have the society today. Without the suffragettes, women would not have the vote today. I would not be able to go to university. I would not have my PhD, because all of those things were not allowed when the women were bombing. And people have defended their rights to exist, to be free, to be independent, as we see right now is happening in Europe, violently, because sometimes that is the only action. There is a larger question over what that means ethically, if we are moving away from that as a society, who gets to be right in that conversation. And it's the oldest adage in the world, isn't it? One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. Well, it's exactly the same if you're a woman. So all of these conversations have to be had, but I don't think they're for us to decide apart from ourselves, for ourselves, if that makes sense. I can't decide how you're going to feel about it. I'm not going to tell anyone out there how they should feel about it. All I can do, my only job as a historian, is to say, this is what happened. What does it mean to you? How are you going to use it to change where we are today?
Yeah, I think you've done that very nicely, because I mean, and I'd like to acknowledge Tom in the chat too, different Tom, saying you know, it's not about lionizing them. It's about even at the most basic acknowledging them. But yeah, I mean, I would argue that we shouldn't be lionizing anyone, but that's maybe another topic for another time. I think at the risk of taking a fantastic topic that's focused on women and their struggles and making it about men. That is not my intention here. But were there allies? Were men allies? You know, were these women married and have husbands that supported them? Can you speak to sort of whether there were allies of these women?
Absolutely. And it is incredibly important, I think, to understand that, of course, there were. We have men's leagues set up for suffrage, so specifically male-only organizations set up to help women-only organizations. But we also see a huge number of men supporting the suffragettes themselves. So one of the people who was responsible for the bombs and for providing the suffragettes with the bombs was a Dutch chemist who was here in the UK, and he worked very closely with the suffragette leadership, helping women understand how to construct these devices and kind of spreading them out across the country. We also see a lot of people who wrote and supported the women. And one of my favorite women who's in the book, Jessie, she is an extremely dangerous and violent suffragette activist. And she is basically the matriarch of a fantastic family, and her husband and her sons are all there. And when they get arrested, they're found like balaclavas and rifles and shotguns, and they then all flee the country in this amazing midnight dash over to France. So it's absolutely a case where women's families supported them, were part of them, men were part of this and fighting for this as well. The suffrage movement has never been about solely women alone against men. Men have often shared and understood the cause and wanted to be part of it and supported and seen women as equal and important parts of our world.
Fascinating. Thank you. This is, I find myself saying this a lot as Tom and I try to explore issues that, you know, maybe are not well-known issues in Canadian or world history, but yeah, this has been very eye-opening. So thank you very much for bringing this forward to us.
You're welcome.
I'm going to turn it back over to Tom, though. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Fern. Yeah, join Chris in saying that was great. It's a great compliment to what we're trying to do here with our speaker series and the talks we explore. Lots of great feedback on the chat. It sounds like our audience very much enjoyed this as well. So thank you very much. And then for everyone watching, in about an hour's time, we'll be back with a talk by Dr. Jamie Goodall as we explore the War of 1812 and the privateer activity that came out of the Chesapeake Bay area in Maryland. So thank you everyone for joining us. Wonderful start to the day and really looking forward to the rest of it. So everyone take care.